Happy Saturday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Market Update, where we discuss leading financial and economic developments in Europe, Asia, and North America. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. And first up, US President Donald Trump signed a sweeping $3.4 trillion budget bill into law on yesterday, declaring it a triumph of his 2024 campaign promises and a major legislative milestone in his second term. Dubbed by Trump as the One Big Beautiful Bill, the law extends key tax cuts, implements new requirements for social safety net programs, and massively boosts military and immigration enforcement funding, all while raising the national debt ceiling by $5 trillion. Quote, "This is promises made, promises kept," end quote, Trump declared at a 4th of July Independence Day signing ceremony on the South Lawn of the White House, where he was joined by the First Lady, Republican lawmakers, and military officials. Quote, "Our country is going to be a rocket ship economically," end quote, he added. The bill, passed by narrow margins in both the House and Senate, was muscled through after intense lobbying by the White House. Trump's push to meet the symbolically important July the 4th deadline included personal calls to lawmakers and last-minute deal-making, particularly with holdout senators concerned about the bill's cuts to health care and food aid. At the core of the legislation is the continuation and expansion of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Individual and estate tax provisions that were set to expire in 2025 have also been made permanent. These include lower income tax rates, higher standard deductions, expanded child tax credits, and a doubled estate tax exemption. Trump also made good on campaign promises by including new temporary tax breaks, exempting tips and overtime pay from taxation through 2028, and adding deductions on car loan interest for US-built vehicles. The cap on the SALT, state and local tax deduction, was raised to $40,000, a key concession to lawmakers from high-tax states like New York and California. Private universities with endowments exceeding $500,000 per student, such as Harvard, will face a new 8% tax on investment income, up from the previous 1.4%. To offset a portion of the bill's $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, the legislation slashes more than $1 trillion from federal programs. The cuts target Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, imposing new work requirements and co-pays, limiting state funding mechanisms, and penalizing states with high error rates. According to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, CBO, 11.8 million Americans could lose Medicaid coverage by 2034 under the new law. SNAP participation is expected to decline by around 3.2 million people. Republicans argue the changes are necessary to incentivize work and reduce fraud, but critics, including Democrats, warn the cut could hurt some rural hospitals and low-income families. The bill allocates nearly $100 billion in new spending for military upgrades and border security. This includes $47 billion for construction of the southern border wall and $45 billion for immigration detention and deportation operations, part of key election promises. The provisions mark some of the most significant increases in enforcement funding in decades. Legislation was passed via budget reconciliation, a process allowing passage with a simple Senate majority. Vice President J.D. Vance cast a tie-breaking vote in the Senate. To remain within reconciliation's budget constraints, Republicans used an unprecedented switch to a current policy baseline rather than the standard current law baseline. This allowed them to count the extension of expiring tax provisions as having no fiscal impact, which critics argue dramatically underreports the bill's true cost. Under current law, the CBO estimates the bill will increase deficits by $3.4 trillion over a decade. Trump administration maintains that increased tariff revenue, deregulation, and domestic energy production will offset the costs. White House trade advisor Peter Navarro estimates tariffs could raise $6 to $7 trillion over 10 years. More conservative estimates from the Tax Foundation, which is seen as right-leaning, and the Yale Budget Lab, which is seen as left-leaning, put the number closer to $1.4 to $2 trillion, which is still a sizable amount. And tariff income is increasing. US tariff revenues surged almost fourfold from a year earlier to a record $24.2 billion in May, the first full month in which President Donald Trump's 10% global tariff was in effect. The figure represented a rise of more than 25% from a month earlier, while the total value of US goods imports remained broadly unchanged from April. The bill comes with some political risks. Some polls suggest the spending cuts cuts are unpopular with voters, and Democrats are already preparing to hit Republicans over changes in next year's elections. Still, the US president and his allies are betting that economic growth, progress on immigration, and some trade war wins will blunt the backlash to some of these spending cuts. Of course, only time will tell. Next up, we move to Europe. Sales of risky European corporate debt surged to an all-time high in June as companies with low credit ratings took advantage of a sharp uptick in investor demand. The rush into Europe's high-yield market follows growing unease about US economic policy, particularly over trade tariffs and mounting government borrowing. According to JP Morgan, issuance of high-yield or junk bonds hit 23 billion euros last month, surpassing the previous record by about 5 billion euros. The number of deals also broke records, with 44 transactions completed in June alone. Quote, "The market is drowning in new deals," end quote, said one investor at a European credit hedge fund, speaking to UK-based The Financial Times this week. That wave of issuance is being met with even stronger demand as global investors look to shift capital out of dollar-denominated assets amid concerns over unpredictable trade policies and the weakening of the US dollar, which is on track for its softest start to a year in more than 50 years. European high-yield bond funds have now seen 7 straight weeks of inflows, according to Bank of America. The result is a dramatic drop in borrowing costs for junk-rated companies, many of which had previously struggled to access public markets. Quote, "There's a massive amount of cash to be invested," end quote, said Ben Thompson, head of EMEA Leveraged Finance at JP Morgan, adding, quote, "It's the kind of market where people are looking at the art of the possible." End quote. Even the most complex instruments, such as payment-in-kind bonds, where interest can be deferred and rolled into the principal, are seeing strong demand. Quote, "You can print pretty high-risk stuff at very attractive rates at the moment," end quote, said one high-yield bond investor speaking to UK-based Reuters, adding, quote, "The market is running very hot," end quote. If you want to continue to be on top of the most up-to-date analysis on global markets through grounded and sober analysis day by day, consider subscribing to Market Update. The channel is 20 subscribers away from hitting 20,000 subscribers, so it would be incredible if we could hit that target, hit that milestone this weekend. If you want to be part of this community, it would be wonderful to have you aboard. And if you're getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Next up, with a critical deadline fast approaching, the future of global trade hangs in the balance. The 90-day pause on additional, what were termed reciprocal tariffs imposed by US President Donald Trump ends this coming Wednesday, and a lack of progress in key negotiations, particularly with Japan, has rattled markets and policymakers. Though the United Kingdom and Vietnam have managed to secure agreements with Washington, Japan remains locked in tense negotiations. The US President has recently sharpened his rhetoric, accusing Japan of decades of unfair trade practices and threatening tariffs as high as 35%. Quote, "I'm not sure we're going to make a deal," end quote, he said earlier this week, escalating fears of a full-blown trade war with a key US ally. Japanese automakers are already feeling the heat. Toyota and Mitsubishi have announced price hikes in the US to offset rising costs from the 25% automobile tariff, reflecting the growing burden on exporters. Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, however, insists that negotiations are progressing. Quote, "There are a wide range of areas being covered and the talks are moving forward step by step," end quote, he said in a televised interview Thursday. Ishiba's optimism contrasts with remarks from US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who pointed to Japan's July 20 upper house election as a domestic constraint. The election is seen as a referendum on Ishiba's leadership, with inflation and economic anxieties dominating the agenda. A rushed trade deal perceived as too favorable to the US could backfire politically for the embattled Prime Minister. At the heart of the stalemate is Japan's auto industry, a cornerstone of its economy and a significant job creator. Japanese officials argue that any trade agreement must address automobile tariffs, emphasizing their company's role in US investment. Trump, however, remains fixated on trade imbalances and has called for Japan to buy more US goods, particularly oil. In a recent interview, Trump floated the idea that Japan could eliminate its $62 billion trade surplus with the US by importing more American crude. While Japan did boost US crude imports in May, rising 280% year on year, they still accounted for only 7.9% of overall imports, compared to over 80% from Middle Eastern producers. Experts say this proposal is unrealistic, however. AJ Premier of ICIS, for example, in a note this week explained that, quote, Japanese refineries are configured for heavy, sour crude from the Middle East. The lighter, sweeter oil exported by the US isn't suitable without major retooling, end quote. Shipping costs and logistical hurdles further complicate the issue, with US oil taking significantly longer to reach Japan than Middle Eastern supplies. South Korea, on the other hand, has adapted more readily, importing 20% of its crude from the US, thanks to state support and refinery infrastructure designed for petrochemical processing. Japan, by contrast, may need to consider a workaround. One option suggested by analysts could be blending Canadian heavy oil with US light crude to better match the characteristics of Middle Eastern imports. But with time running out before the July 9th tariff deadline, such solutions may come too late. Japan was the first to engage in talks over the paused reciprocal tariffs, yet 3 months of discussions have yielded no breakthrough. Trump's frustration is mounting, and the threat of 30 to 35% tariffs on Japanese goods is back on the table. Whether a last-minute deal can be struck remains uncertain. They have until this Wednesday. The next few days will be critical, and we will be following these developments very closely. Okay, that is today's weekend edition of Market Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Saturday. Have a restful weekend, and I will see you for a new week, what will likely be a very big and busy and eventful week, starting on Monday.